So we're going to go ahead and just get started. So this conversation is a fun one for me because it's very rare that I get an opportunity to talk about addiction these days, at least not in the way that we're going to talk about it tonight. And yet so much of Mind Movement, the company that I'm the CEO and founder of, was born in addiction research, understanding, science, and working with that population. So welcome. Thanks so much for being here with me. It is kind of an honor to be able to teach on this topic. And it's a really important topic. It means a lot to me personally and to all of us at Mind Movement. In a very sincere way, many of us, including myself, have had a long history in recovery and with substance use disorders. And then of course, as an extension of that, know lots of people, many in the world of recovery and many who are still in the thick of it. And then of course, all of the loved ones and friends and family of those people. And so this is a very personal topic, but it's also one that I spent many, many years studying the ins and outs of. So as you can see, back in the 90s, I started really with addiction. I started my counseling career with addiction while I was still at the University of Montana. My first job in 2001 after graduation was with a company called Phoenix House, one of the largest treatment providers in the United States. And from there, just took a little sabbatical, but just sort of kept working in the field until more recently, where all of that information that had been grounded, all of my learning from the days of working in such a meaningful way in the world of addiction, it taught me so much that became the basis for everything we do at Mind Movement. And so we're not going to get to that part probably in a really comprehensive way today. Today, I want to focus first on just the definition and looking closely at what addiction is and what it isn't. So this, as I said, is a really important topic for Mind Movement, but it's also number one, drugs and alcohol are what gave me motivation to go to school and to study. So how I wound up in psychology was because I thought that how drugs worked in the brain and in the body was fascinating. And I knew from my own experience that, the fact that you could take like the teeniest little amount of a chemical and put it in your body and have it transform your perception really quickly, that got me. So not only did I have that experience firsthand, but I wanted to understand that. And I also wanted to understand the mechanisms, what was happening in the brain and in the body that was causing that experience. I also understood inherently that the chemicals, and this is a big one for later, but the chemicals that I was messing with drugs and alcohol, were the same neurochemistry, the same chemicals that had something to do with mental illness. And so that was really curious. And I kind of was like, what is that all about? I need to know more. So that is ultimately what led to like years and years of obsessive studying, because I'm an obsessive person. And then once I sort of felt like I had known everything I needed to know about the world of addiction and substance abuse, et cetera, I then started to actually attack the recovery side. So I wanted to know at the brain and body level, how are people recovering from addiction? And then how do we use that information for everyone, whether they have a substance abuse problem, no matter what, how do we use that information to help people become happy and live the life that they want? And so that's where the relationship between addiction and Mind Movement are so closely linked. And they're really, really important. So moving right along, the word addiction is derived from a Latin term for enslaved by or bound to. And that's a quote from Harvard Health. And then, of course, anyone who has struggled to overcome an addiction or has tried to help someone else do so understands why the word addiction has to do with enslavement, why those words, why they go hand in hand. Because certainly, if you've ever been in the throes of addiction, you really are, whether we like to admit it or not, a slave. So here's our agenda. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this, but as I said, today is just what's addiction? What is addiction? What isn't addiction? And we'll see where that takes us. But my hope is that we can do this over the course of a few Thursdays. We can look at what addiction is, why it happens. We can really develop an understanding of specific substances of abuse and try to develop the level of respect that they deserve, because these are the strongest neurochemical enhancers on the planet, and they deserve a lot of our respect and understanding. And then now what? Right, the million-dollar question: what is recovery? How do I overcome this? What does that look like? And what is life, as a recovering person look like? And how can we help ourselves and other people begin down that journey of recovery? And then, of course, there's the wreckage and the aftermath, or information specifically for the families and loved ones of someone who has an addiction problem, which is also a really rich conversation and very helpful if anyone is stuck in what feels like a really chaotic and horrible in many ways cycle of loving someone who can't stop using drugs and alcohol. So I want to start today with what addiction is not. And there's so much incredibly bad information, not just about this, but in the world in general, and around many things. So it's important for us to look at what addiction isn't. And so it isn't, these are common myths about addiction. And I think some of this is going to be very obvious, but it's not just for homeless people or those who are drinking out of paper bags. I think many of us have an image, though, of, someone isn't an alcoholic unless they are in the worst possible way. And so, of course, that isn't the case. But I still think that lingers as an image. Or that you must be strung out, or that I would be able to tell if somebody was addicted. I was so good at hiding my addiction that when I finally came clean, people said, "No, that's not true. You're not an addict." Talked me out of it. Tried to talk me out of it because I hid it. I hid it from everyone and continued to achieve and went on and got master's degrees and did really well in school and had a full life. So, understand that you may not always know, and they may not always look strung out. People often will say, well, I still have a job, so I'm not an addict. Of course, I think logically we probably know that is not true, but it's important to mention here because you can have a really good job. You can have one of the top jobs in your industry and still, of course, have a problem with substances. The two have very little to do with one another. And yes, are there people who are severely addicted who no longer can keep a job? Of course, yes. That it only occurs in the cities or in certain socioeconomic groups or in certain ethnic groups. Obviously, by now, I would hope that we all can say with certainty that is not the case, that we know somebody in multiple socioeconomic groups or in different ethnic backgrounds in different parts of the world that struggle with this problem. This is an interesting one, and I think this may push against common sense to a degree. So people who drink or use over a certain amount, that addiction has something to do with being high or drunk 24/7. Now, of course, if someone is drunk or high 24/7, they obviously have a problem, but you can be someone who almost rarely drinks or uses and still have an addiction. So we want to try to separate the amount from whether somebody has a problem. And I know that's hard to do because on its face, it makes sense. Of course, logically, well, if I want to know if I have a problem, well, how much do I drink? First question we might ask, how much do you use? But the truth is, at the end of the day, that's really not the marker of addiction. Those who can stop for periods of time must not have a problem. Oftentimes, and I see this a lot with alcohol specifically, people who maybe drank for many years, they'll say, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Maybe it's like New Year's and I decide to have a big night on New Year's and I wake up on New Year's Day and I say, you know what? I'm not going to drink for the month of January. And I do it. I am able to do that. It may not be easy or fun, but I'm able to do it. So then, of course, February 1st rolls around and I say to myself, oh, okay, so I don't have a problem because I can stop. See, I don't have a problem. I can stop whenever I want to. Not understanding that one of the hallmarks of addiction is not whether you can stop, but whether you can stay stopped. Big difference. Oh, this is a really popular one right now. And, I'm sure there will be plenty of people who want to argue this with me, but this is not a personal, these are not a list of my personal opinions as much as they are my professional objective knowledge. So whether or not you want to continue to smoke marijuana or think of it as an addictive substance is none of my business. But I can just tell you that THC is very much an addictive substance. And especially the way that marijuana or that people are ingesting THC today. So the marijuana that people are smoking now is not the marijuana of the 1960s and 70s. This is very extremely concentrated marijuana. And when people are vaping or using the wax or these very concentrated amounts of THC, we are talking about an enormous bang for your buck, a really intense dose. And that makes it even more addictive as we get to really understand, addiction and some of the nitty gritty. You'll learn that it's not just what the drug is that you're putting in your body, it's how you put it in your body, when you put it in your body, at what age you put it in your body, et cetera, et cetera. So THC is very much an addictive substance. We tend to, and goes for some people more than others, but we tend to say, well, if it's legal, then it's probably the safer choice. Or, so now that, marijuana is legal in some places, somehow just the fact that now it went from being illegal to legal, it's safer and not a problem, not problematic. The same thing goes with alcohol. Well, your alcohol is legal, so I don't have a problem with my kids drinking alcohol. I just don't want them doing hard drugs. So we'll talk about that more, but that's a super dangerous road for parents, and I'll explain why. So obviously, legal does not mean safe or not addictive. Oh, and also, by the way, alcohol is the only psychoactive substance that impacts every major organ system in the body negatively. And for many, also, alcohol is as addictive as heroin. I have worked with young people. One client comes to mind. She was an 18-year-old girl who really, in less than a year of being introduced to alcohol, was drinking a liter of vodka at a sitting. Extreme alcoholism. And for her, because of her genetic predisposition and other factors, it was just as addictive as heroin. We also like to think of some drugs as the good drugs and some drugs as the bad drugs. Alcohol, prescription drugs, legal, safe, good. Crack, heroin, bad. And then we tend to, of course, by nature, we extend that out to the person. Well, this person is using alcohol, so they're okay. This person over here must be a bad person because they smoke crack. And so, again, addiction is addiction, and it has nothing to do with moral character. It has to do with the nature of substances in a body, in a human body. And along the same lines, it is not a failing of willpower. And I really want to help people understand this. If you are not an addict and you've never had the experience of understanding or knowing what addiction is, you probably have had the experience of trying to lose weight, because that's such a common occurrence in our country. And you know how easy that is, right? So now imagine that you are dealing with something that is, 400 times as strong, as powerful, and you're trying to use sheer will to stop doing it. You know, it's not about willpower. It's about the way that drugs affect the body and mind over time. It's really that simple. Willpower, though, is that thing. Willpower is essentially saying, like, when you don't want to get up and go to the gym today, but you go anyway, that's willpower. That does not apply when we're talking about active addiction. That you have to have some kind of horrific childhood or big trauma to become an addict. So I see this a lot, that people who would come into treatment, outpatient treatment, inpatient treatment of all ages, would sometimes want to rack their brain for some missing, trauma. Like, well, I must have been abused and not remember it as a 7-year-old. So no, and we'll talk about why. Absolutely not. Addiction, everything is in the eye of the beholder. So I can have what seems like a very loving, wonderful upbringing and still suffer with a lot of internal turmoil that ultimately sets the stage for an addiction later. And finally, that addiction is a choice. And even as a professional working in this field for years and years, and knowing firsthand, secondhand, and academically what addiction is, when I was dealing with a loved one, someone very close to me, a close family member, and watching their behavior, I remember I was working at in radio at the time. This was years ago now. I was on the phone screaming at the top of my lungs at this family member who was stuck in their addiction, screaming, "Why don't you just stop?" I mean, at the top of my lungs at the radio station at like 11 o'clock at night. And afterwards, of course, I felt terrible because I know the answer. Like, what do you mean, why can't they just stop? They can't stop. If they could stop, we wouldn't be having this conversation. It's not a choice at a certain point. It is about the nature of the drugs running the show. It's not a choice. And I know that's hard for us, but it's not a choice. So those who don't have a problem don't have to make an effort to control their use. They can take it or leave it. Now, this was a revolution for me when I first met somebody who fell into this category, because most of the people that I knew valued substances at a high level, whether it was because of family gatherings or things that you did at big holiday parties. But I just came from families where alcohol was a pretty regular, normal thing. So I didn't really have exposure to anyone who was like, "Oh, no, alcohol. Oh, I don't drink. It makes me feel out of control." I mean, that was like, what? So what I came to know, of course, is that if you're someone who's thinking a lot, if you spend a lot of thought power on how much, should I have this, should I have that? No, I counting drugs and out, counting drinks, that's not a great sign if you're concerned at all about having a problem in time. Because people that don't have a problem, they really don't care. It's not that relationship. It's very different. So that's what addiction isn't. So then what is addiction? First of all, addiction, the word, is completely, utterly not present in the world of psychology. In the world of psychology, we use the terms substance use disorder, and then we qualify that as, is this a mild case? Is this a moderate case? Or is it a severe case? We distinguish between someone using a substance, someone abusing a substance, and then someone being dependent on a substance. And I'll try to explain what that means. So when I say addiction, I'm really just saying that to you guys because so you can understand clearly. But for like, if I was doing this in a clinical training, I probably wouldn't use the word addiction at all. In a way, addiction is the perfect storm. It's the perfect kind of intersection between your genetic biology, the circumstances of your life, the environment that you're in, who you're influenced by, the culture that you grew up in or are around now, your belief system, what age you are when you first pick up substances, what substance you pick up, and how you choose to use that substance. There should be something added to this, and it should say for how long. There should be a time component to this as well. Now, interestingly though, for example, if I'm not someone with a genetic predisposition to becoming alcohol dependent, it would take 8 to 10 years of heavy, like Friday, Saturday, Sunday use, pretty heavy, probably before my body starts to veer into dependence, into addiction, into real addiction. So that doesn't mean that there can't be a lot of other qualitative personality-like addictive pieces, but purely looking at my relationship to that substance, it's about an 8 to 10 year average. However, if I was to, start using heroin, which is, it's misleading because if you started to use heroin, you probably already are using other drugs, but let's pretend for a minute that's not true. And you picked up heroin tomorrow. It really only takes about 3 days of active heroin use, certainly before you develop the physical dependence, but also, also in many cases, the psychological dependence would follow. And by psychological dependence, I mean, can't stop, can't stay stopped. So not can't stop, but can't stay stopped, has to go back. So, because it's very common for addicts to stop for periods of time. Okay. So, and one other thing about that, how you use a drug is also really important. So, for example, an intravenous drug user has a very different problem and experience than a person who's taking morphine. They're just different in terms of how they affect the brain and the body. And so you can get very different outcomes to the user. And again, these are little details, but so it's often, and this is interesting and we could debate this all day, but from a medical model standpoint, addiction is often compared to illnesses like diabetes. It is very much recognized as a brain disease by the National Institute on Drug Abuse because of these factors. First, there's a biological basis. There's something that's happening at the level of the brain and the body, at the level of the cells of a person. And what is actually happening is these chemicals are hijacking your central nervous system. They're hijacking how your nerve cells communicate and ultimately then affects several different systems of the body and of your experience. It has very clear, identifiable signs and symptoms. And certainly one of the reasons that I wanted to sort of step away, not fully away, but to the side, working with addiction directly is because of how predictable it became. It is very predictable. So if you have worked with addiction or been around addiction for a long time, it is very predictable. There's very little in the way of surprises in the world of addiction. So it has a predictable course and predictable outcomes. As I put here, to the point that it's a little silly. And the irony in that, right, if you're stuck in an addiction, part of the way that manifests is being alone. So even though everyone who's ever had that problem, one of the symptoms is feeling like you're the only one that understands, no one understands you, you're the only one who's ever been through this. It actually is really very, very similar, regardless of the substance as well. So the only real difference, obviously there's differences in terms of like withdrawal symptoms, but addiction is addiction. And so once somebody has, stepped over the line into the world of having a dependency on drugs and alcohol, it really manifests the same way, regardless of the substance of choice. And I'll explain that a little bit more. It also is something that you have for life. Now, I know people probably don't want to hear that or maybe don't understand that. Well, what do you mean, Sam? You're telling me that if I don't drink for 40 years, that, year 41, I still have alcoholism? Like, shut up. That's stupid. Well, actually, I think it's probably really easy for you to understand this. So think about think about your best friend or like your first love, somebody you love deeply. If you hadn't seen them for 40 years, how long do you think it would take for you to start to remember them, start to remember the old days, start to remember how you interacted together in your friendship? So how long would it take before you were reunited and reacquainted with that old friend? Now, for some of you, if you're as old as I am, I've had the opportunity to answer this question firsthand. And somewhat recently in my life, I was reconnected with friends from way back in high school. And I can tell you that was 25 years. 25 years, crazy. But so 25 years, and it was probably like an hour. That's what I'll give it, about an hour. I have not seen this person for 25 years. And after about an hour together, it was like 5 minutes had gone by since the last time we had seen each other. And that has to do with how the brain and body operate, how the memory, learning systems, your sensory information, how your body stores information. So it's exactly the same as an old friend or a first love, only stronger. It's stronger. Now, the strength of an impact of something in your life. This is from an evolutionary perspective. So you can think of it purely like, think of the theory of evolution. So from an evolutionary perspective, if I put my hand on a hot stove, how many times do I need to learn probably not to put my hand on that hot stove? I probably don't have to learn that more than once, not to put my finger in a light socket. I probably don't have to learn that more than once, because it has, in terms of like the pain and pleasure, the way that it maps on adaptively is such that we remember. So we don't have to be taught that again. We may not remember the nitty-gritty of what it felt like, because we forget pain pretty easily, but we remember that it was painful enough not to touch that hot stove anymore. Well, the same is true on the other side. If something has an incredibly powerful impact on me, in love is the best example I've got. If you've never had an addiction, if you've hopefully had the experience of being in love, or if you're a mother who has had a child. So if you're one or the other, then you know this experience. You have activated the strongest neurochemical experience that one can have naturally. So without drugs and alcohol, the experience of a mom holding her baby for the first time, she's flooded with dopamine. I'm sure everybody's heard of dopamine. That's that pleasure neurotransmitter, and oxytocin. And oxytocin has a really intense kind of endorphin effect. So the combination, it's like this incredible, intense punch. That combination is what we experience when we fall in love, and when we first lay eyes on our baby, as the mother, it's very specifically mom. Now, why would that be? So, from a purely evolutionary perspective, why would it be that I would have such a strong, intense flooding of neurochemical activity when I look at that baby? So, obviously, right? Because in order for our species to survive, and in order for that baby, for me to continue to want to take care of that baby, I've got to remember, right? I've got to get that flooding, that intense, intense rush of neurochemistry. This, however, system that keeps our species alive is also what makes us extremely vulnerable to addiction. So when so if you've had that experience of being in love or of having a baby and you first lay eyes on them, that's the closest you're going to know to what drugs feel like. Something in that general vicinity. So, and obviously when that whole system, when something is really intense, when we feel really good or bad, it imprints on the brain because your body thinks this must be so important that I can't ever forget it. I should remember this forever. And not only does it remember this forever, it also remembers whatever else was in your sensory purview in those experiences. So that's why addiction is a lifelong condition. That doesn't mean whether you decide to wake up every day and say and declare yourself as someone who has an addiction, none of my business. But I'm just explaining from a purely biological standpoint why it is the case that once you've got it, you've got it. And the saying in 12-step culture is once a pickle, you're always a pickle, right? Can't go back to being a cucumber. So as I said, so one way for you to conceptualize, and this is just helpful throughout our conversation, one way for you to conceptualize how the brain works, I like to use divots in the sand or ski slopes. So Dr. Rahul John Deal is where I got the ski slopes metaphor. So think about your brain as like a super highway system, or a giant ski slope, or like what happens when you are riding your bicycle on the sand. So if you're riding your bike on the sand, the first go round, you're creating that divot from scratch. So it's going to be harder to ride your bike. But let's now say that, you've had 20 people ride behind you and you start back at the beginning. Now you've got a really well-established groove in the sand. That is how neurotransmitters look and are ultimately creating the wiring that is your memory network, that is your experience, your sensory perception network, your belief system, and what it looks like as those things start to connect and merge. And that's important because when we talk about mental health and we talk about addiction, and really the only reason this conversation is important, by the way, is because it informs what to do about it. The reason this is such important information is because it's going to give us the keys to how to get out of it. That's why we need this information. And that's why it's so important to understand how the brain, how imprinting happens, how memories occur at the level of the brain. Now, the other thing to keep in mind, most people don't know this, every decision that you make, every single one. So whether I decide right now to stay here and continue watching this conversation or get up and go to the restroom, that decision will come down to an automatic pleasure-pain ratio decision that you don't even know you're making. And so that's what we do. Every single decision is like really can sort of be surmised to, or, at the very smallest level, it can be sort of like whittled down to how much pleasure am I going to get versus how much pain is this going to cause. And so when you think about addiction, it's a double whammy because first, there is, and we'll talk a lot about this, there's nothing that you're ever going to experience in natural life that is going to give you the same intensity for the same amount of time as certain or as most drugs of abuse. And you know that if you've ever had a drink of alcohol, you know that there's really what other experiences do you have that give you a similar type of intense feeling or reaction? Very few. The only others are drugs. And so these things leave intense euphoric imprints. It can take, for someone who's been addicted to opioid painkillers or heroin, it can take over a year for your brain to forget what that high felt like. And so that's referenced as euphoric recall. And that someone who gives it up living with the memory of what that felt like. And that makes that first year of recovery quite difficult, because when things get difficult, when you don't feel good on a bad day or even on a good day, there's this thing you could turn to and it would reliably make you feel so much better. And so that's where the rub or that compulsive feeling to go use comes from or looks like. But here's the other side of it. So you have that pain, the pleasure memory, but you also, when you're in the throes of active addiction, you know that it will get rid of your pain. So if you're in the middle of the next day after a terrible hangover even, what's going to take away the hangover better than more alcohol? Now, certainly we could, argue that that's not always a socially acceptable thing to do, but plenty of people do it. So alcohol is still our number one most abused substance on the planet. So, but in every other case too, when you have a dependency, because of the nature of the drugs in the brain, which we're going to talk about now, it causes pain to not have it. So it's both, I'm going to receive pleasure from doing this thing, and I'm going to avoid pain. And that's what makes it so hard to stop using drugs. I mean, really hard. And I want to be very clear for people, recovery from addiction is extremely difficult, extremely difficult. So more on what addiction is. Addiction is the byproduct, is the outcome of how the body deals with repeated use of really intense, strong toxins. That is what it is. What happens at the level of the body when you continually put a toxic foreign invader in, naturally, it tries to get rid of it. It says, this is, just like if you have a virus, just like if, you get food poisoning, it thinks this is toxic, get it out of me now. And all of your resources, all of your energy goes to try to rid you of these toxins. But if you keep putting that toxin in, you say, your body's saying, get this out of you, it's horrible. But you say, no, this felt really good. I want to do this again. 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 If you keep doing that over time, what happens is the brain makes an adaptation. It says, oh, okay, well, I guess you obviously want to keep putting this stuff in. So I'm going to have to make some changes so that I can make room for this chemical that you keep putting in. And that adaptation is what ultimately you experience as an addiction. So I want to try to make it really clear with the little time that we have today that my main point for today, my main takeaway, is that drugs and alcohol addiction to drugs and alcohol has very little to do with drugs and alcohol. So I really want that to be clear, that addiction is not about drugs and alcohol. It's about what happens at the level of the mind and body as a result of continually reaching for drugs and alcohol. There are changes at the level of how you think, changes at the level of how your personality, changes at the level of your emotional experience, at the level of memory, at the level of executive function. So those changes that are a result of the hijacking of the brain in these areas, which we'll eventually talk about, causes so much disruption in a way that, again, it's very predictable. Someone is basically taken over. They're basically taken over and then get stuck in a compulsive relationship with this foreign invader, with this toxin. So the repeated use and abuse of chemicals causes shifts to the brain's communication system, blah, 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 which naturally produces neurotransmitters, and then how the brain wires and forms learning. Okay, so this is sort of, technical, but ultimately this is speaking to what the adaptation is. So when I put drugs in my body repeatedly over time, what happens is my neurotransmitter activity changes, and how my brain wires in terms of memories, learning, in terms of predicting the future, in terms of executive function, emotional intelligence, et cetera, all gets hijacked. And it's a way of keeping you alive. That's why it happens. It's what addiction is all about. It's about trying to keep you alive and healthy, because as a way of adapting to you continually putting this stuff in your body. Remember that the body is always looking to conserve energy. It's always looking to conserve energy in case, so that in the event of a life-threatening situation, you have the reserves to escape. So your brain uses an enormous amount of energy, and so for its size, and you are always looking to conserve. And that is why when you keep putting these toxins in, at least that's a big part of why, the brain makes this adaptive decision. It habituates as a result. So addiction is an illness of the body and mind. It's physical and psychological, which is really the same thing. Thoughts are, so psychological means thinking, and then physical means the body. But thoughts are physical, so thoughts means body. So bear with me here. Every thought you have changes your neurochemistry, so it changes your body. But then that change in neurochemistry affects all these systems of the body, which then affects your thinking. And so they kind of have this constant, this dance. So your thoughts and your biology, they're always dancing. And throwing drugs into the mix, you've probably seen what that looks like in the end. So one concept that, if you know me at all, and I'm sure some of my guys are on this call and know me pretty well at this point, and certainly if you have questions, put them in the Q&A, and I will do everything I can to get to them. Yep, it's a great question. So somebody asked, why would someone choose to use drugs later in life? And you asked it at the most beautiful time, because I'm about to answer that question directly. So What most people don't get about drugs and what they don't get even as teenagers. So it's true that a lot of drug use starts early, before the age of 18. But why somebody uses drugs repeatedly is almost always the same. And so I will turn our attention to that right now. We are a magic pill culture. So we have been taught and told that in order to be happy, we have to find something outside of ourselves to be happy. So I've got to achieve higher, or I've got to, oh, I know, I'll go eat some ice cream and that'll make me feel better. Or if I only had a boyfriend or a partner, then I could be happy. Or if I only lost 10 pounds, then I could be happy. Or if they would just stop drinking, then I could be happy. So we have become extremely dependent on the manipulating of people, places, and things to try to be happy. We've also adopted a quick fix mentality. Like, we want it and we want it right now. Like, for example, if we all, started watching infomercials of, oh, there's this pill and it's going to make you skinny in 3 months. I mean, I know I've done stuff like that and gone and purchased things that had those promises. And of course, that didn't work, surprise. But the idea is that's what we want. We want something that's going to right now fix. And because of the messaging of, marketing and advertising, billions of dollars that go into that to get understand, what am I trying to say? Understand that billions of dollars go into getting you to take an action. That's what it's all about. So marketing and advertising, it's about, how do I get you to associate something really positive with my product and get you to take an action either now or later as a result of this advertisement. Why is that important? Again, all of this is pulling on our decision making. And the sum total is, I could be happy quickly if I had some magic pill. And then there is, and I'm gonna jump. So remember, I mentioned that from a purely adaptive perspective, oxytocin and dopamine are the strongest punch in terms of feeling good that you can have without drugs of abuse. So, or without drugs, that includes potentially pharmaceuticals. They don't have to necessarily be ones that you're actively trying to abuse, but without putting a psychoactive substance in your body, this is the strongest combo that you're going to get, right? Okay. That combination is designed to come from human interaction. So bear with me, because this is going to answer your question directly. So we are designed to essentially take our cues from other human beings. We have two essential primary drives. So the body has two, number one and number two. No matter what is going on, it has, everything comes down to one and two. One, survive. The body is always concerned with survive. It's survival first. So no matter what, if it's the middle of the night and you hear a loud bang in your kitchen, no matter what, your body is going to, what was that? Even if you know it was probably your dog, or even if you know you left the window open and it's probably just the wind, your body can't afford to question it. It just says, you know what? Danger, potential danger, might be life-threatening. So it's always primed for survival. Again, that's why we're always conserving energy. So, okay. The second thing that it is the primary drive, the second drive is connection to other human beings. Why? Because there will be no other human beings on Earth if there is no procreation and if there is no human interaction. Because if you go back to the 250,000 years that we spent as hunter and gatherers, that's how we lived. We lived in tribes. We were dependent on each other. This whole idea of like independence first, I can do everything myself, is very new. It's a very now idea. But it was not, even though it's exalted now, it was not exalted then. It was not possible. We all had our part to play, and without each other, we were dead, period. So connection is a primary survival drive. That is why we get flooded with this oxytocin and dopamine. It essentially tricks us. Think about if you've ever been in love or thought you were in love, what happens? Oh, you go crazy, essentially, right? You become a crazy person. You can't stop thinking about this person. You overlook a million of their flaws. You dream about what life will be like. I mean, whatever it is, you think about them all the time. The same way you think about your newborn all the time. And that, again, it's adaptive. It's so that you'll, hate to say it, have sex with them and carry on the species. Okay? So, what does this have to do with addiction? Addiction goes into the brain in the exact same areas as oxytocin and dopamine, the parts of the brain that are designed to connect with other human beings. We are supposed to, we're built to get our sense of joy, connection, fulfillment with other people. That's the design. However, I've been very fortunate in my training to get to train with really like the world leader in what's called addiction as an attachment disorder. And that's only because a group of us at Hazelden clinicians paid out of pocket to find this man and fly him from Georgia to come train us. And his name was Dr. Philip Flores. Now, this guy, amazing, taught us about addiction and how it maps on in the same areas of the brain as our relationships. Okay. Now, you're starting to get the idea. People will ask, well, how could my son or daughter or loved one steal from me? How could they do that? Why would they steal from me? We had such a great relationship growing up. They stole from me. They broke into my house and stole from me. Well, when you're in the throes of an addiction, it literally, those chemicals go into the area where their love for you exists and trump it. So they no longer are in a primary attachment. They're no longer in a love relationship with you. They are now in a love relationship with it. And it's almost impossible for somebody to be in a primary attachment with both. If we look at rat research on mice and rats, it's a known fact that if you separate the baby rats from mom, if you separate them, the mother will chew through the cages, 2 cages, to get to the babies to feed them when she hears them crying. If you inject mom with the teeniest little dose of opioids, heroin, morphine, she'll just lay there and look at them. And that, I love that example because it sort of explains, right? Kind of perfectly, gives you that image. So the reason that, so getting to the specifics of this question, the reason that people use drugs later in life is because let's say that, so we have this circuitry. So remember, this is using drugs later. So I have these parts of my brain that are designed to feel good around people. But what if that doesn't happen? What if instead I feel scared around people? For whatever reason, we're not going to get into why, because it's always in the eye of the beholder. But we develop that area of the brain and our trust in other people very early on. 0 to really 2 years old. But let's say that, for whatever reason, I experience my mom or my primary caregivers as unpredictable. So I don't know when they're going to feed me again. I don't know, you know, it's just, I don't know when mom is coming home. For whatever reason, I experience the world as unsafe. And remember, this is all pre-verbal, right? This is childhood, early childhood. What happens is that person has more cortisol at baseline. In other words, they're more often anxious than somebody else. Okay, fine. So what? What that does, though, is it sets me up to get something from drugs and alcohol that I don't get anywhere else. So it's very possible that, for just circumstances' sake, let's say that when I was in high school, I had strict parents, or I was very anxious and I kept to myself, or all I cared about was studying, or I was an athlete, didn't think drugs were cool, or didn't think alcohol was part of the deal. So I go through most of my life, even without really having much to do with substances, largely because I'm either getting my needs met somewhere else. I just was scared of them. Many people, they're scared of them, or they just don't wind up picking them up. But what happens as we get older, right? So you see where I'm going here. Drugs and alcohol give a person who becomes addicted to them relief. They give him intense relief. And if you've ever think of yourself so you're uncomfortable at a party, a wedding, say, what's the first thing you do? Well, if you're me, old me, the first thing I do at a party, if I'm uncomfortable, go right to the bar. Whew, where's the bar? Let's go, right? 2 shots of tequila, I got a drink in hand. Whew, right? How long before you feel that warm sensation down your back? Now you're kind of loose and you, right, feel good. Now you can go talk to people and not feel that anxiety. Drugs and alcohol are the most effective mood alterers on the planet. They are reliable. They are, you always know, and addicts can get brilliant at this. They know 1 of these plus 2 of these plus 1 shot of this equals exactly the way I want to feel. And once you learn that, it's very difficult to walk away, because the strength of that intense pleasure or relief from anxiety and depression, that kind of thing, it's so strong, right, that you feel compelled to keep doing it and keep doing it. That's how it happens. Later in life, something you need to know for those that are, as we're getting older, what happens later in life, we start to have the traumas of our past catch up with us. So as we get older, if there's stuff I didn't deal with when I was a kid, and now I'm starting to, right? I noticed it with all of my cohort, people that are in their late 30s and early 40s. I noticed it starting to happen in our cohort. I have somebody asking me a question. Let's take a look. Hold on. I hope that answers the question. Did that answer the question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh, great. Okay. So, yeah. And so that is, that part about relationships, going into, it's really sad. So if I am older, and see, as we get older, we're so susceptible, because think about it, maybe you've had divorce, maybe you've had challenges with your children, maybe you've had, or you have a difficult marriage, or you have whatever it is. As we get older, life gets more challenging and more complicated. And so it's easy to fall into a pattern later in life of picking up substances, again, because of the relief that it gives. And remember, drugs and alcohol are a lot more predictable than human beings. So, perfect place to kind of stop. I hope that helps you understand addiction in a little bit of a different way. There's certainly a million other, you know, pieces to look at and to talk about, but I think that this starts to give you a picture of, at least at the level of motivation, how and why it's so difficult to walk away once you have started to develop what I think of as a love affair with drugs and alcohol. Um, does anybody have any questions? Because I don't want to. So someone asks, at what age do you think it's appropriate to start? So how to address, this is a great question. Um, Sue is asking, how do you address talking to your kids about alcohol and drugs? And it is an amazing question. Unfortunately, there's no textbook answer. It really depends on a number of factors. But here's what I would tell you. Remember this. People turn to drugs and alcohol to feel better because they're so effective at feeling better and making them feel better. So if I don't need, though, in other words, if I have tools to feel better without the need for something like drugs and alcohol, what you're going to find is people say things like, well, I tried drinking and I got really sick, and so I'm never doing that again. In other words, they don't experience it as relief. They experience it in a painful way, as all the negative stuff that comes with it. They don't want to feel that way because they feel okay in how they are built, you know, as they are. So all of that to say, give your kids tools for how to deal with difficult emotion. That if I could stress one thing about how to, because we're not going to stop our kids from possibly experimenting. You can control that, but if they don't need drugs to feel good, they don't need drugs to feel good. And that's the key. And that really looks like, you know, mindfulness, meditation, yoga, all of the things that, and, you know, my daughter and I play what I call the frog game. She's 6. We've been playing the frog game probably since she was 4. Sometimes she pushes against it. Oh, mom, I roll. But when push comes to shove and I'm starting to get angry, she goes, Mom, I think it's time for you to go meditate. What that tells me is that she knows that there is a tool in the world that can help her when she doesn't feel good. So just the fact that she knows that at 5 or 6 years old tells me that, okay, like that gives me a little bit of ease, and slowly helping her, giving your kids different ways to feel better so they don't need drugs is a much more effective strategy. Now, one thing though I will tell you, and this is really a big conversation, but for parents, it's an important one to know. There are 3 common factors. So these are the 3 most common factors that many addicts have in common. So these are not causal. It's not that this caused that. It's just that, again, most addicts had these 3 things in common, but not all. 1, age of onset. So they started drinking and using earlier, before 18. Well, why does that matter? For a number of reasons, but the number one reason is because drugs are much more toxic in an immature body because the organ systems are not fully developed. So what happens is the potency of those chemicals goes up. So what might be like 1 drink for you as a grown adult would be like 3 drinks for them, which is part of what makes them so much more susceptible. That, and of course, right, the immature emotional and executive functioning piece. The second common factor is genetics. So if you have twin studies, it's between 50 and 75% when twins are separated, obviously not on purpose, but when twins are separated and then they identical twins, and you look at the the likelihood or the percentage of those that both go on to develop a problem with substances, you're looking at between like 50 and 70%. And if you have a first degree parent or relative, it's at about a 50%. So we know that there's also that predisposition. And then the last one, and this is the one to pay attention to, is parenting style. So the permissive parenting style is the one that you really want to watch. So, as one thing we know for sure, being the type of parent that says, oh, just give me the keys and you guys can all stay here, is definitely not the strategy that you want to employ if you're concerned about substance abuse and addiction. And the reason is because children cannot do that. They don't have the ability to create boundaries like we might. So if I'm saying, alcohol is okay, but drugs are bad, I've given them the green light, and they have the green light. So we know that one thing you want to just know right off the bat is you don't want to co-sign it. You don't want to make it okay. That's going to bump up the percentage of likelihood that they may have a problem later. But how to actually talk to your child and when would be a conversation that we would have to have one-on-one, because it depends on who your kid is, depends on what the family situation is, and other variables. So it really depends. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it says, I think in today's society, we need to put our phones down and talk to our children. Yeah, it's very much about, so two things. You have to also remember that part of being our kids, part of being a child, is trying to emancipate from us, is trying to individuate, is trying to be their own person. So as parents, the best thing we can do is reiterate over and over that we are there to listen, so that if and when things were really serious, they would be willing to come to us. I know my daughter does this too. I'll go to ask her something like, how was your day? Or I'll try to talk to her. And then she says, come on, Mom, stop. Don't ask me any more questions. But then before bed, when I'm with her and she, doesn't want to go to sleep yet, that's when she'll start just telling me all about all these things. Or that's when she'll say, Mom, something happened today that was really upsetting. Somebody made fun of me, whatever. So you have to there's this careful dance, because if we push too hard, we'll just push them away. So you really just want to offer them the space, and honesty. Honesty is always, always, like you're saying, you want to have meaningful dialogue, but children, they don't do what we say. They do what we do. So if there's a pattern within them that you see that you don't like, look at what it is that you maybe are or aren't doing, or the household norms, because that's where kids get it. They get it from us. And so it's never about what we say. It's always about what we do. And that's not, I want to be very clear, that doesn't mean that anyone's to blame, right? I mean, I'm not saying you're a bad parent or, this person's, it's not like that at all. It's just that's from 0 to 7, we learn by watching and observing and experiencing. And so we're like little sponges. After 7, it all becomes about, kind of more like the way adults learn. But any other questions? So I will be back here next Thursday and the next couple of Thursdays to continue this conversation. If you have questions that we didn't get to answer today, please feel free to email them to info@mindmovement.com, and I will be sure to answer them next week. Also on Mondays, we are going to be starting a roundtable at 4 o'clock on Mondays where expert professionals come together to talk about addiction. So, for us, we think this is the most important conversation right now, especially because of what's going on. Historically, right, times like this, people turn to drugs and alcohol. And so, we want to make sure that there's a conversation where people can get the truth and legitimate, credible information if they want it or need it. So definitely, you can go to the website for more information on that. Thank you so much for your time and your attention. I so appreciate it. And I'm grateful to be able to be here with you guys. Have a wonderful rest of your night and enjoy the weekend. Be well and stay safe.